So, hello and welcome everyone to Fugitive Chefs, this show where we talk to people who have stepped away from traditional kitchens and sort of reimagined what it means to work in food. This week we have Curro Polo. So, Curro is somebody I know personally. So, yeah, first of all, welcome Curro to the podcast.
Thank you.
And yeah, Curro, as I was saying, is somebody I know personally, which is not, I don't have that fortune with all the guests. Most guests I've come to know through experiences, through following them on Instagram, seeing their work. But Curro, funnily enough, we met 4 years ago. And what's the reason I say it's funny is because we have many a times crossed paths and without wanting to. So, first of all, I don't know if I ever mentioned this to you, Kuro, but the first time I heard about you was through some ex-colleagues of mine from Noor who were the head chefs over there in Noor,
Yes.
and then you ended up working with them in Can Cook, right? So these guys first told me about Kuro. They said there's a guy who's going to come to intern at Mugaritz, and he's already there. Also, I think that's already talking about Fugitive Chefs. Your first interaction with Mugaritz actually was in the sala, in the front of house, right?
It was actually in the office. It was
Okay.
managing reservations.
Look at that. So, yeah, I mean, for me, it's very interesting how people end up in the kitchen because typically it's people who already are kind of misfits. And I mean, misfits in the most positive sense of it. People who know they can do this well, but they feel that there's another calling which is bigger, right? So, right after that, I met Kurro in another context, which I had just come back to work at Mugaritz on the payroll after like the COVID stint. And Kuro then started interning in the kitchen. So we had, I think, one season together the whole year. I left Mugaritz. Kuro stayed. Kuro was hired. And after that, I went to BCC, the Basque Culinary Center. And then again, we crossed paths because Kuro started doing a master's in gastronomic science, which is again very funny. And now I'm still working at BCC. Kuro was out for a bit, which he'll tell us about. And Kuro is back in BCC doing a PhD. So I think I've tried to make a short summary for people starting on the episode to have some sort of context on the kind of profile Kuro is. But I would say before we dig into all of that, Kuro, just tell us about, I mean, this is something I ask all the guests, like how did you end up in food? What is your first interaction? Something with your upbringing, or it was academic, scientific? What was your first interaction with food?
I mean, probably my first interaction with food was me being a kid and loving eating.
Yeah.
In my house, since I was very, very young, my mom is she's a great cook, and I would love, like, I remember myself just spending a lot of time next to her. At that point, I'm not sure if it was just because I liked cooking or because I liked the food she would cook and I could eat. But I remember like endless afternoons just seeing my mom, and I think that was my very first approach. And then very young, I would say I started like getting very, very interested about food, mainly cooking at the beginning. Then it went into the scientific side, but I think that was my very first approach.
Yeah. And I mean, how did you kind of formalize it? Was it the only kind of career you thought of working into? Or how did you think that kind of interest, which is very passive, becomes something like an active career option?
So in my city, I didn't really know any cooks where I was from, and then I was probably 14 or 15 when I was convinced that I wanted to study something related to culinary. And at that point, I knew I liked cooking because I liked cooking, but I wasn't sure if I liked being inside a kitchen. Which then I found that it was something really different.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember speaking with my mom and being like, look, I really want to start some kind of career that would allow me to cook. And then we were kind of like looking at it, and I ended up studying kind of like hospitality, which had a lot to do with cooking, but like it wasn't a culinary school. Like we wouldn't get like practical cooking lessons. It was
Mm-hmm.
more focused on, let's say, the management side of food. And then while I was there, I was able to do a few internships. So my first real approach towards cooking was probably when I did my first internship, which was here in San Sebastian in Arsac. And that was my very first like walking into a kitchen. And it was really fun. I ended up loving it.
Yeah, I mean hospitality because that's something I studied as well, but for very different reasons. Because at that point, India does not really have culinary arts schools. There's a very few now, and good
Uh,
restaurants in India are mostly into hotels. So you mostly do hospitality.
yeah,
But for
for sure.
you, I guess, I mean, you were studying many subjects like front office, housekeeping, and the game. So, I mean, the first internship with Arsak, how close or far is it from your perception of kitchen coming from a school?
It was really far. At that time, I just really wanted to jump inside a kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And I literally spent like a lot of weeks just sending a lot of CVs and letters around. And San Sebastian was a city that I was like, it looks pretty cool. I mean, look at those guys. They have restaurants all over around and they're crazy with food. And then one day I got a phone call, and it was the people from Arsac, and they were like, look, would you we are more than happy to welcome you inside the kitchen. And I was like, yeah. And then I went there, and I think I was there for 7 or 8 months or so. Very intense
Wow.
and really cool. I
Yeah.
got really nice people from it. Yeah, for sure.
Ah, that's very nice to hear. I mean, for me, like looking at, I mean, I did not know your Arsak bit, so I've met some people who've worked at Arsak, and the general perception of Arsak in the city, people know how what kind of a restaurant it is, because of course San Sebastian has a lot of restaurants, but all of them kind of fall in these different groups of things they are good at. And
Mhm.
considering what you do now, which we haven't spoken yet about, but it seems to me very far from the kind of food Arsak serves, right? Because Arsak stands for tradition, legacy, kind of preserving that. So was it there that you got exposure into the scientific side of things, or what was that experience for you? Like, what do you carry from there today?
I mean, I think that Arsak exposed me to the world. Like I
Mm-hmm.
was 18 years old,
Mm.
and then you suddenly jump into a city that is not yours, inside a kitchen that is full of international people, and you're there. You don't even know what a julienne or like brunoise
Yeah.
is. I remember the very first time they asked me, "Okay, you have to do julienne." I was like looking for julienne or Juliet around the kitchen. Like I had no basis at all.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, well, obviously that was kind of like, okay, this is going to be tricky. I expose myself to like all of these incredible people coming from all over the world. Being a chef when you're 18 years old, you feel that you have to be like Anthony Bourdain. So, you
Mm-hmm.
start going out and then you have fun, and then you discover all of this like side of hospitality that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah.
And I think of Orsac as a place where like I grew a lot. I mean, I'm not very talented with my hands. So like I definitely learned a lot with like about the theory of cooking and tradition for sure, but I mainly learned a lot about like, I don't know, life lessons and things that you just learn when you hear to people that have more experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that was incredible.
And how come the choice after, like, I mean, yeah, that was your first internship, you go back, say, finish the degree, and why, like, what was your next choice? Like, because I mean, most people who start off, especially in the kind of hospitality schools I've been, start with the interest primarily in cooking, unless you have some background of somebody you know who you aspire to be a general manager, possibly in a hotel. But how was that journey of like going and seeing all these different aspects, seeing how in a way easier physically the other kind of jobs in a hospitality sector is, and knowing how physical and challenging being in a kitchen is? What choice were you, like, what kind of choices did you make towards the end of
For
it?
me, it was really passion driven, right? For me, like I saw that a Michelin star restaurant was gonna be kind of like a ratatouille vibe, where you would go and like there's violins inside the kitchen, and
Yeah.
then the lobsters are dancing around the stove, and everything is amazing, and you are 18 years old, and you walk into the kitchen with a head chef, a hat, and I don't know all of those things that like I was obviously very mistaken, but like it was very natural. I found a lot of passion and a lot of energy, and especially a lot of diversity in kitchens. A lot of diversity. You would have people from, again, all kind of backgrounds, and for me that was like amazing, and they were all wearing the same chef jacket. So like that's
Mm.
something that really captivated me at first inside a kitchen. I was like, this is very, in some sense, democratic in a way, because like this is, I don't know, I felt that it was just a place full of colors that I wanted to explore. And I remember one day in Ursac, again, you mentioned it, Ursac is really rooted in tradition, and they started speaking about like these restaurant outside the city that they do whatever they want with food, and like they're a little bit like, I don't know, like they weren't very happy about this crazy restaurant lost in the middle of the forest, where they were like not respecting the product and things like that. And I was like, I need to go there, and I had a second internship that I had to complete. And the problem is that it had to be administrative. So the very first
Mm.
internship had to be operational, and the second one could be like administrative, like more office oriented. And that's where I aim to continue like this culinary career in Mugaritz. And throughout the years of university, because like the first internship is the first year, and then the second is the third one, if I'm not mistaken, I
Okay.
would like organize dinners at home. We were living a lot of students in one house, and then we would
Mm.
just kind of like clear the living room and do like very long menus for kind. Like we would do like, I don't know, easily 22 courses inside a living room. Obviously, you can
Oh,
imagine
wow.
the quality
Yeah,
of the
yeah, but
food,
still.
but there was a lot of hope and attention and care
Yeah.
on the whole thing.
I can imagine the young energy, like learning all these things,
Yeah, big
watching, coming
time.
back from internships, bringing all these, yeah, these
Yeah,
kind of
making foams
stuff.
inside your kitchen,
Yeah.
and you were like,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
I'm cool.
That's I mean that's yeah, it's a different phase altogether. You know, that kind of yeah, the university life is by itself. I think very nourishing also because I mean, as you said, from not just from restaurants but also from my university days. What I take the most, I think, is not I mean, skills. I think the last thing I've taken from there, I think, is more the people, the kind of community you build, because that yeah, you count on that at the end of the day to
For
yeah to
sure.
fall back on. And how was that exposure in Mugaritz? Because like I mean, everybody going to aspire to be in Mugaritz kitchen, and then you end up in an administrative kind of role because your university requires that. How was that
Mhm.
experience? Like, what did you get to see? Because I mean, a lot of things happen in that office. You hear a lot of conversations. You kind of feel the
Yeah.
pressure even if you're not in it. So, how was that experience?
I mean, for me, it was really, really nice because I really wanted to be in Mugaritz. Like those years before that second internship, I became kind of like obsessed with that restaurant. And I remember like sending them emails being like, could I go this summer to intern for 2 weeks inside the kitchen? And they would always say no. No, because you don't have like, we cannot take you either because it's, we don't take people for that short time or just because you don't have experience. And it's risky for a restaurant to take an intern that doesn't know how to cook. It could be dangerous inside the kitchen, as you know. So I was like, okay, I have a second internship and it has to be inside the offices. And they were like, what? And I was like, could I go into your offices? And they're like, what do you mean? And I was like, I don't know, you give me whatever job I can do. And I just want to be there, to be very honest. And they were like, sure. So we created this kind of like intern position inside the offices, and they were extremely nice with me because they gave me like a very like wide perspective of the restaurant. My days were like, okay, Curro, you need to like learn how this management system works, or you need to
Mm.
learn like they really like hosted me incredibly well. And at that point, they told me like, look, there's a possibility of you going into the service team if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
And you could be, I think it was the spend the mornings in the office and then the afternoons in the service room or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I mean, if you want to risk it, I have never carried a tray. I'm more than happy to do so, and I
Mm.
really want to learn how to do it. And they were like, sure. And that's how I went into the service whole, thing in Mugaritz, and it was
Wow.
an amazing experience.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean it's cool, right, to get in contact, like first-hand contact with people who are dining at Mugaritz, how the experience translates. I think kitchen is kind of also. I feel like it's I don't know. I feel, I mean, many kitchens today, like those like Mugaritz, Noma, and I mean, all these new theatrical places, the chef does come in contact. I mean, even if not just the head chef, but also the team comes in contact with the guest, which I found very nourishing. But I think having that on the service side of things and hearing feedback, I think it's a super cool experience to see it from the diner's point of view, which most times in
for
the kitchen
sure.
we kind of ignore, you know?
100%. And I think everyone in the kitchen should once in a while just exit the kitchen because it's really amazing to see people interacting with food and the powerful messages that can be delivered through just one plate and some words from a waiter is incredible. And it's really, really powerful. I've seen people crying at Mugaritz. I've seen people getting absolutely mad in Mugaritz. I've seen people clapping. I've seen people dancing. So it just all around the same plate, and that is really incredible. At least for me, it made me think a lot. I was like, now I understand what is going on because like all of this effort, like having a reservation system, having people working in the offices, having people working in the kitchens, the providers, like the social media managers, all of that just for people to put something into their mouth, that is mental. That's crazy. And when you're in service, I feel like you get a hint of why that could be important
Hmm.
for the world.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's very demanding, but at the same time, it gives you, as you said, it's a very I mean, it's a great spot. It's not a very safe spot because you're kind of without any covers to kind of cover for you. But it's kind of, yeah, I wouldn't say dangerous, but you put yourself in a position where you could be asked things maybe you don't have answers to because the dynamics
For sure.
like expects you to know everything about what's
Oh yeah.
happening. But I think it's a great place to have this view. And Kuro, moving on from here, like your the next one, I think after that, after the service, after the office, then the service, then you ended up in the kitchen internship, right? So what was that, your first exposure to fermentation? Because that's a topic we want to touch a lot in this conversation. Or where was your first exposure to fermentation?
I think that was the very first one.
Yeah.
Mugaritz is very known for fermentation, and then at that time there was this amazing cook that you know as well, Dimitrios
Yeah.
Stasulis, and he was kind of like managing this whole fermentation side in Mugaritz, the operational part, and I was just mind blown by the amount of things that you could do throughout this technique, and also about the passion that it drives and that it takes from people. Like this guy, Dimitri, for example, he was like a Bible. He knew everything, and he would spend hours on studying things that, in my opinion, were like, why are you studying that? Then I understood. But that was definitely the very first encounter. It was Mugaritz and their whole
Yeah.
philosophy of fermentation.
Yeah, I think also the way they do it, I think is very strange because it's not like, because I think for many restaurants you can, I don't know, you can pick up the Noma's book of fermentation and then copy and paste and do a lot of kojis and misos and kombuchas, whereas Mugaritz goes beyond that and how they, I think it's a very artistic approach to fermentation, which you can't just, I think it's a lot of, which is why I think people like Dimitri study it, or like Ramon and people who are there in that department, because it's a lot of studying a concept of how, I don't know, how spores of koji grow and then applying it to a texture or a material or something
Yeah, it was really
different
cool.
altogether, right? And then you stayed on in Mugaritz, you worked in the kitchen and on the team. How was that experience of like seeing every side of the restaurant, but now being in a position where you're being paid, even if it's too little? I think that's debatable if it's a good pay, but at the end of the day, you are kind of accountable for the job you're doing, right? So how was that experience to be in that position?
I mean, it's definitely very demanding. And I remember, and you know this as well, we would invest a lot of hours inside and outside the restaurant because you had so many people that were coming from all over the world expecting a lot from you. And those were the interns that some of them would have, and you've heard a lot of stories as well in these kind of restaurants where you have people that have sacrificed their lives and have sold everything they had at their places to buy a plane ticket to go to that place to intern and to learn. And when you realize that, you are like, I need to be really good at whatever I do because these people deserve it. Especially in Mugaritz, where in Mugaritz you do teach techniques, if you not call it like that, but there's something bigger there that you need to make sure that you deliver to people, which is a commitment to throw questions on the table, the commitment to think without fear, to question whatever you have around. I don't know, having all of those people, and I was clearly not prepared. I don't think anyone is prepared to suddenly open the doors and then you have 20 people like, "Hey, yeah, yeah, yeah." It's like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? And I feel that you just do a very like big learning process, and you're like, it's okay to say, I don't know. It's fine if I don't know how to do it. I'm not a machine. So there's going to be things that these people are going to do even better than I know how to do. So it's a good, conversation between I'm the one that needs to tell you we need to do this, but you might be better at doing that than I am. So let's cooperate here and let's make it happen. And I think that was the experience, but it was definitely very demanding. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's beautiful what you said. I think, I mean, in my case also, that the few years I worked there was a lot of receiving. I thought I would be the one. I mean, of course, the person who's coming there to intern, maybe straight out of school, some of them changing careers. I had an intern with me who was winning, I think, the Taiwan version of X Factor and coming as a singer,
That is
changing
so
her
cool.
career. There was a girl who was she was a paramedic in Argentina coming to intern. So there's like one girl who was coming as a human resource expert, trying to change her career. So it's people like this who have tons of expectations from you, but I think each of them have, like, I've learned a lot from all these interns and colleagues and people who were there who did not think they were in a position to teach. But I think there's a lot of stuff I've learned, and also learned to kind of sort of let go of this position of, and there is a hierarchy, of course, which makes the kitchen work, because if not, that would be madhouse. But in the sense of the hierarchy is only for the operation and not for who knows more or who knows less. I think education is very much there is horizontal transaction, whereas organization is something which has to be vertical, because of things have to be work and you need to find who's responsible for them. But moving on from there, Kuro, because for me this is a very interesting part of the podcast. But again, it's not the major chunk which I think listeners are here for. Of course, there are people who are like passionate about restaurants, who want to hear how your experience was Mugaritz. But over here, the platform is more focused on, now we've established how much you're into it, how much you're I would say, an admirer of that kind of job, and you have good memories from it. But why the change then? Like, why not just continue? Because there are a lot of people in that ecosystem, like Mugaritz, like many restaurants, who stay there for 30 years and they are still enjoying it in a certain. I mean, I don't know if they're the prisoners of their choices or they're actually enjoying where they are. I mean, that's up to them. But for you, you're somebody who has kind of pivoted from that kind of career, which is, I think it's difficult, because I was in your shoes at some point when I was like going to Noma, and I'm like, I'm throwing this away. Then I was at Noma, like, okay, I'm going to throw this away and go to a different position. So it's a very pressured decision, because the whole world makes you feel that it's a very privileged position to be in. But at the same time, you feel there's more to this. So for you, how was that transition?
It was probably for for a very stupid reason. And I remember just being in Mugaritz, and then so as you know, Mugaritz would have like their restaurant, but then they would sometimes once in a while carry on projects for other companies.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was there was this company, they were a microwave like cooking company. As in like they would prepare rices that you would just buy, put them in the microwave,
Oh,
and
okay.
you
Yeah,
open
yeah.
them and you eat it.
Okay.
And they had a problem, which was that they would do this recipe and then the rice would turn out very like overcooked.
Mm-hmm.
And they contacted Mugaritz. They were like, "Would you consult us on this topic?" And I remember Ramon taking over the project with Julian.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I had at that point I was in the morning shift, and I was like, I would love to like hear about this project. Can I go in the afternoons and then you
Yeah.
teach me a little bit? And then they were like, yes, sure. So there I remember just cooking rices, like rice and 2,000, 5,000 different kinds, and just like squishing the rice and trying it and trying it and trying it. And at some point we managed to solve it on a very interesting way.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked. And the company applied, that equation, and I became a little expert on rice cooking. And
Yeah.
I was like, okay, this is fascinating because obviously throughout those months we had to study. I had no clue what amylopectin was, but like what
Mm-hmm.
happens, what is, how does rice get cooked? Like how does water enter the grain? Why does temperature matter? All of these things that I have never asked myself, I asked to myself thanks to that project. And I was like, this
Mm-hmm.
is extremely cool. And I spoke with Ramon and I was like, I think this is my thing. I love studying rice. And he was like, maybe you like studying food, not only rice. And then I was like,
Yeah.
maybe you might be right. And that's how I started entering this world food science. And just by that time, the pandemic hit. So I had a lot of
Yeah.
time at home to study not only rice, but other kinds of food matrices. And I think that's how it started, thanks to a company that sells rice in gas stations and cool supermarkets. So yeah, big time.
Yeah. And then did you detect, like, I mean, I think it was during that period that you detected that you have kind of, I don't know if you're missing out some academic tools or maybe academia could help you kind of have a strong base for what, if this is your interest, how to dig deeper into it? Or was it just because you think that kind of a course would help you open doors to kind of apply for positions which have this as a full-time job? Or why did the master come up as an idea?
I think it's because like I'm normally a very like innocent person, and knowledge has this really cool thing on innocent people that is like
Yeah.
when you learn a little bit, you think that
Mm-hmm.
you know a lot. And then
Yeah.
you feel that you can apply that in many places, right? And then you
Yeah.
learn a little bit more, and then you're like, oh my God, I was so wrong. I know nothing. But
Mm.
at that time, I was like, I know what happens with amylopectin. And then I was like, I might as well just develop it. So even before the master degree, during the pandemic, Harvard did something really cool, which was they created this platform called edX, and they
Yeah.
basically had it before, but during the pandemic, they decided to release all of the courses for free. So
Mm-hmm.
you could have access to really good teachers and a lot of knowledge just by sitting in front of a computer and just listening and taking notes. And that was kind of like my COVID project. I did the course on science and cooking
Mm-hmm.
online, and I was like, this is insane. I fell in love. I kept on studying. I started, buying books and studying a lot. And that's where the master came. So I spoke again with Ramon,
Mm-hmm.
and he was like, look, Curro, there's this opportunity of doing this master in the BCC, which is about food science and gastronomic sciences. There's one issue, which is like the first 4 months you have to work here because your contract is not over.
Yeah.
So we'll be generous enough to put you in the night shift and you can go to the master in the morning. And that's how it started. I
Oh,
started the
wow.
master in gastronomic sciences and it was really cool. It was amazing.
Now, I mean, tell us about, because I mean, of course, I can tell about what the Masters is like, but I think it would be nice to hear from somebody who's been in the Masters. I mean, this is not a promotion for Bus Culinary. Honestly, I have no stakes to sell the Master, but I would be very interested because I think it's a very unique way on how they do it. But yeah, tell us how, for you, if you had to like kind of pitch it, like a make a deck for the Masters, how would you explain it, and what did you take from the Masters?
So he's a master who's very focused on food. So you hear a master in food science and you would expect that you're just going to jump into a lab. They're going to give you a white coat and then you're going to be doing all of these measurements and you're going to understand food from the most analytical point of view. But then you go into that master and you get so confused because you have philosophers coming to teach you. You have uh, people from the world of politics. You have journalists. You have chefs, you have scientists as well. Yeah. these all of these people speaking of the same topic, which is food, and then you have a lot of projects to do with like restaurants, with the industry, with like schools, and it's like I would say a year and a half of like a lot of information. You get exposed to a lot of information, and a lot of that information is very contradictive, right? Like you would hear a philosopher coming to speak about this topic, and then the next day you would have a microbiologist saying the opposite. And that is really cool because I feel that is a master that they pay a lot of effort and they put a lot of effort into creating a critical way of approaching food. Because like as anything on life, there's not just one side. Like it's very naive to think on food as a deep object is clearly a 3D object and has many different faces. So I think that the seed of the master is like we're just going to expose these people that are coming again from all of these different places in the world to a lot of different definitions of food. And then from all of that, you make your own sandwich and then you do whatever you want with that sandwich. But that was for me the master in food science from the BCC, and it was an incredible experience.
Yeah, it's super cool. I mean, I find very interesting how they bring a lot of guest speakers and a lot of the amount of topics they explore. I think is super interesting. I still think it's like I think it's a very small exposure into the kind of 10, 15 channels they open. But I think if somebody has interest, it gives them enough to kind of specialize, maybe, I don't know, sensory science, statistics, I don't know, whatever,
Yeah, for
textures,
sure.
whatever the person wants to. And for you, I mean, it's what is surprising for me and what is interesting to know is because coming from restaurants, somebody would think if you do this masters, you will kind of improve your CV or do kind of a research because you have a final year project. So somebody would think you would do it more positioned at restaurants, maybe go and work at an R&D lab of a restaurant to be able to get a job over there in the future, you know. But you chose Harvard, if I'm not wrong. So how did that happen? Like, why Harvard? What was your final year project like? Your thesis from the masters? Yeah, tell us more about that journey.
So from all of that sandwich of things that they
Yeah.
that we said that they exposed you to, one of my favorite topics was the most basic
Mm.
and traditional scientific approach to food. I really fell in love with the analytical side of science, and especially with the side of like microbiology. And at that point the master had a kind of like I wouldn't call it agreement, but it's just a position in Harvard with this science and cooking program that I did for the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, this is really, really cool. And I spoke with my, at that time, thesis advisor, which was Juan Carlos Arbolella, the director of the master at that time. And I told him, I think I want to work on this topic and I really want to see how academia works. Because maybe, and that master is pretty cool because the people that comes from academia and more scientific jobs would normally go into restaurants. And
Mm-hmm.
the people that comes from the food industry, as in like first line hospitality waiters or cooks, would normally end up in like
Mm.
big labs or academia. And that was the transition. We did an interview. There was kind of like a selection process. And then one day they told me, they were like, look, this position, you can come here and develop your dissertation here at Harvard. And I was like, wow. With the people that I was seeing for like a year
Mm.
on, on the screen, it was like, that is crazy. Yeah, it was pretty
Yeah,
cool.
small world, right? And how was it being in Harvard? Like, what was your topic? Like, why? Like, what did you focus on during your research in Harvard?
So the research itself, I mean, I went to Harvard thinking that I was going to work on filamentous fungi, especially in Aspergillus oryzae, because we spent a lot of time working with it during the master. And I was convinced that I wanted to analyze how, let's say, the volatiles, so the aromas would change depending on the fermentation conditions. That was like my very first idea. And then I went there and I had a really great colleague, Alejandra Tauceda. We were kind of like mates inside the lab. She was the lab manager. And then she was really helpful because she would be like, okay, you need to, create a hypothesis and you need to like follow all of this system, which is called the scientific method. And then I just couldn't come up with a good question. And then at some point, she was like, okay, Curro, why don't you forget about this koji thing and you work on kombuchas? Because since the very first day that you came into the lab, you've been brewing kombuchas in any kind of way I've ever seen in my life. And I was like, that is very interesting. So I decided to measure how the volatiles of the aroma formation would change depending on the tea and the aging conditions. So you would brew your kombucha, you would put it into a bottle, and then depending on the amount of certain compounds that you would have, you would get other kind of compounds in the final product after an aging process, kind of like a champagne. And then you would take those liquids, put it through gas chromatography, which is a really fancy and cool machine that basically separates the molecules that are inside your liquid and are volatile enough that can be subtracted. And then it gives you like peaks, or let's say amounts of molecules that you have, and then you can compare among different samples how your fermentation went, for example. And that's what I did at Harvard. And then I stayed for a little bit longer as a teaching assistant for the program of the science and cooking. And yeah, it was really cool. It was incredible.
Yeah.
A
Yeah,
really
no,
fun
that's
experience. Yeah.
yeah, super interesting. I mean, somehow in this podcast, many guests I've had are from the world of fermentation. Is very surprising to me because that was not the idea of the podcast, but it's slowly turning into, like, we had Johnny Drain, we had Joachim from
Uh,
Moody Drinks, we had Christian from Netherlands, and I mean, I think most listeners listening to it can get some value from it. It's still people who are still in kitchens. So from the research you've done, what do you think? Is there something that could be simplified and translated to people who are doing, maybe preparing kombuchas or looking at like beverage in restaurants as such? How much of this is translatable to everyday operations? Have you kind of learned something that could optimize the production or get a different value or open a new flavor in terms of beverages?
yeah, sure. I mean, I think that everything can be, and I wouldn't say simplify, it
Mm-hmm.
can be approached in many different ways. And in the case of this project, I was measuring very specific volatiles because we were targeting certain volatiles that are produced by a yeast called Brettanomyces. And it's a yeast that if you're coming from the wine world, you want to kill it. It's like the Darth Vader of the yeast because it's
Yeah.
like very invasive and it produces like what they call horse blanket aromas or funky
Mm-hmm.
aromas and all of these things. Like, like in our and Mugaritz, I fell in love with that yeast. And it's a yeast that is present in kombucha. It's like from, if you take every sample from kombucha that has been, let's say, screened to see what kind of like strains were inside, it always has a fair amount of some strain of Brettanomyces. Something that you can apply at home is thinking that if you take a kombucha and you put it in a bottle and you're in for carbonation and natural carbonation and you want to forget of your kombucha for like 6 months, the chances of getting a lot of funkiness is very high because it turns out that in the tea leaves, there's a lot of these compounds that create that funkiness. So if you want to aim for a very thin and, let's say, more friendly drink, I would suggest to maybe ferment it shortly in the bottle or try to do so with just single strains of yeast, but definitely not with just a kombucha matter. And I take it and I put it in a bottle because that's like a rave of aromas, funkiness, and diversity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way. I mean, that's the point of fermentation, right? In the end, it is spoilage, but the fact that makes it, I think, appetizing is the way you control it. So I think yes, we have enough videos on Instagram of people popping kombucha which touches the ceiling, but I think with people doing research like yours, I think yeah, I mean, it's also very very curious on how much, because I'm like, with my work right now, we're using a lot of these, I would say, industrial strains of kombucha from Christian Hansen, other companies like this, which lets you kind of upcycle a lot of ingredients, which goes then beyond just creating a kombucha with a mother and SCOBY. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting research that you're coming up with, and I feel a lot of it is gonna contribute to answer some of the bigger problems, and that brings me to your PhD. But it's funny because actually today itself I was writing a newsletter for the past few days with a colleague of mine who's the first PhD in Basque Culinary Center, Elena, and we have this chefs community which we were writing a newsletter to on how, if PhD is somebody's next ingredient as a chef. So we interviewed Ruben, we interviewed Paula from BCC, so a lot of people who have Oscar also from your batch. We interviewed him on like what's their view, because again there's also a new article that came up last week which says of how academia has a lot of PhDs, but there's not enough researcher positions in the pure academia field, which is different in your case because again the kind of PhD you're doing is very unique by itself, and I think fills a different demand. But tell us about, I don't know, the inhibitions you had or the thoughts you had before signing up to the PhD, and why did you think it's the right step forward for you?
So while I was carrying my master dissertation on this whole world of secondary volatiles produced during that secondary fermentation, sorry, I really enjoyed studying because like the truth is that when you study something, and I feel that some people might think that when you study kombucha, you literally have your bookshelf full of like books, kombucha volume 1, kombucha volume
Mm-hmm.
2, and
Yeah.
etc. And for me, the real joy was like really being able to read about psychology, about like economics, about like all of these things, and then giving them sense into the topic that you're researching. And I feel that that's something that pretty much any researcher in the world, and I'm sure that it happens to you as well, has have to do. Like you cannot just limit yourself to one point of view, because otherwise you don't create anything. So for me, I was like, I really enjoy this. I enjoy being able to spend time just studying, taking books, underlining them, and trying to, question myself what is going on. And the very natural step was that position of the PhD. And then there's also a very like a romantic side when it comes to a PhD. And I'm sure that some PhD students would be like, this guy's crazy, but I want to see it like that as well, which is kind of like, so, you're born. And if you're born in a country that like you have access to school,
Mm,
most of the countries you will have to go by law. Since
hmm
you're, let's say, 6 till you're 14, you're obliged to go to school. Then when, at least in Spain, when you're 16, you take the decision of like, do I want to continue with school or do I do something else? I go to work,
mm,
whatever happens. If you take the decision to continue, you do what we call the bachelor, right? And
hmm
then there you specialize yourself a little bit. You go either for science or for humanities, what we call. And then among those people, a smaller percentage decides to keep on specializing and go to university. And then some people might go to university, they spend 4 years in university, and then among that pool of people, even a smaller percentage might go to the labor pool. Some others might go into a master degree. And then till then, your responsibility, at least in my opinion, with society is to learn. You need to
hmm
study. You need to be as excellent as possible. You need to commit to your homework. You need to be good at whatever you're studying. But that's, in some sense, one of your own responsibilities.
hmm
Now, the difference with a master and a PhD is that a PhD, you not only need to prepare yourself and to study, but you need to give back something. You need to create knowledge. You're supposed to have enough knowledge in your hands in some way of a very specific topic that you're able to raise a new question that is going to generate new knowledge. And you do not get a doctoral title if you haven't proved that you have created new knowledge. And in my opinion, it's a good way to like, you cannot go to school to a master to whatever, you don't have a social structure that allows it.
hmm
So it's important to promote PhD students because those are the ones that like kind of like in some sense would in a very strict and academical way develop knowledge for society. With this, I'm not saying that like PhD students are the only ones that develop knowledge. Obviously, no, that would be silly. But in the most strict sense, I would say in terms of paper knowledge is a good tool to do so. And I find a lot of beauty on that, on like, you not only have responsibilities towards yourself, but you need to be very aware that like there's people that pay taxes for you to do that. And you need to be really responsible on that. I like that. I think it's good. And I think it's a good way to like give it back. I don't know if
Yeah.
that was completely off the question, but
No, I
that's
mean, it's totally, I mean, it goes towards where I was going next for me. Like, I love how because that's how I see PhD students as well. They are somebody who are not just receiving education, because at the moment they're actually not actively receiving any education received during a PhD through the institute is more like how to present your thesis, how to make it, what kind of coordinators you should have and stuff, and what structure you should have. I think it's putting little method to the madness, which goes on for
Yep.
4 years in the best case scenario if it's very, very efficient. But how do you see the role of universities in that case? Because again, universities are so diverse in the way they work. There are private ones, there are public ones, there are ones which are very institutional, there are ones which are just popping up for the sake of, like, I don't know, MBA in India, for example. In India, there are tons of universities giving out MBA, and then who knows what's the value behind it. But how do you see universities, at least in your context? What role do they play in society? Because also I feel the largely working sector of the society feels like these are just, I know people who share the opinion that universities are just doing something which is very outdated. They're not really actively contributing to an economy, on how economies work. That's the whole capitalist view of what we're seeing in the States, for example, of seeing universities as just people using government funds, kind of extending a person's. There's cases in India, for example, a very famous one, but you'd have to know India for that, where people have been blamed for. There's a very famous activist who's been blamed for being a 32-year-old PhD student who's studying African studies, so basically Indian African
Mhm.
relations, on how to shape economies in these countries which are developing economies. So a lot of society, I feel, has this opinion which is not so positive about the universities. How do you see, as somebody who's been outside then adopted it as a choice? So what do you think? What role do
Mhm.
these universities play in today's scenario?
I mean, I think that on one hand, there's like a clear role that universities should play among society, which is there should be bioreactors of opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Universities should be places where you go and you get exposed to different points of view. And throughout, you have a conflict, you have like discussions, and then you have arguments, and then you use your arguments in order to change your mind, to learn something new. So on that hand, I feel that, especially maybe nowadays, where sometimes you feel that, there's someone making it even harder to like find spaces where you can speak freely about whatever you want. And universities should be those little capsules, in my opinion, where people can go debate about anything without any fear of being pointed from one side of the other for like, that you can leave it for the streets. In my opinion, universities should be places where there's absolute freedom of speech and to express yourself. And it's pretty hard to do so, I'm sure, but like maybe one good step would be to like bring things down to earth.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's a lot of feelings in universities, and that's good. But like, in order to find truth, if there's something closer to truth about something, it's good that both parties are kind of like chill and they're willing to like share opinions, to hear something new that might not be comfortable for them. And
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, that's a role that universities should play. They should obviously educate people. They should allow students to be rebel and to honestly to fuck around in the good sense. Like those universities that are like, impeccable and super clean, and there's not angry students,
Mm-hmm.
red flag. That's a sign of like there's something that is not going well. A
Yeah.
good university has students that are fighting for an ant, and they
Mm-hmm.
get absolutely crazy because the apples are green and they're not red. For whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason, it doesn't matter if it's stupid, but you want to have a very active collective of students that are just arguing with or without good reasons. That I don't care. But you have students that are complaining because when they complain, they generate a lot of motion, and that can bring good questions that then maybe the more mature side of society can at least try to rethink and interpret.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, maybe that's a good way of saying it. And then obviously doesn't matter if it's public or private. A university belongs to society. And they
Mm-hmm.
should be open places. Anyone should, and that happened a lot in Harvard. You had classes where you could just go and visit it and listen. And you had every single day there was a congress about something. And sometimes it was, I remember one day I went to one that it was the benefits of using fentanyl on
Mm-hmm.
hospitals. And then that same day, 1 hour after, you had a society against fentanyls, the reason why you shouldn't. So
Mm-hmm.
that is really good. And that says a lot about universities. When you have a university that wants to like show, this is what's going on, come here and we'll chat about it. And yeah, for me, there's not a line, like obviously, and I respect both. And I think that they're both important, like both public and private, and they commit to their purpose. But
Mm-hmm.
we should not forget that like universities should build things for society, because they're for society. They are a tool for society, and that's very important. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we might forget about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it has to be places that create value. I feel they do create value. And I think in the world that we are in today, there's very few platforms which don't have a bias. Again, I'm not aware of the fact that there are universities which have bias, and that's just human to have bias. But I think they have structures which let people be in an atmosphere, as you said, like as a PhD, as a theory, for example, you have a platform where you can create hypotheses and you can work out those hypotheses if
Yeah,
they work out. If somebody in the world has that idea, that's the best place to have a safe environment to be able to giving people all these tools they need
absolutely.
to create this hypothesis, because it's out of this madness and chaos that the most beautiful solutions and the most beautiful things we need for the world to continue come out of. And moving on from there, Kuru, I would like to come back a little to now where you are today, because I know also, like, okay, before I go there, let's tell me a little bit about Lollipop, because that's also, I think, super interesting as something which is also, and I think it's your kind of how to channel this kitchen past. Tell us about it. I think I already know about it, but for the listeners, tell them what is Lollipop Gatherings.
The Lollipop Gatherings is a project I started back in university with a really good friend. She lives in Berlin. Her name is Joanna. While I was doing those, dinners, we would gather a lot of people, and we were like, okay, that's pretty cool. So I remember when we finished university, she was like, hey, we have all of these good friends around the world, because it was a very international university, and it would be a pity to kind of like lose contact with them. So we should start a project. And she's a really cool person. So I was like, don't explain me more. Let's do it. And we created Lollipop. The main idea was like, we're going to travel around the world if possible. We might go to one restaurant. These people let us cook, and we'll just figure out how to, we'll stay other places or whatever. So it was an excuse to keep on traveling the world. And then we did that for the first year. And then we obviously face ourselves towards having to plan things and having a budget and all of these things. And at that point, we decided to like kind of like make it more formal if possible. And we started making like more organized events. And that's when a third person jumped into the equation, which is Magdalena, which is a food photographer. And so right now, Lollipop is us three. And what we do is kind of like we scout around for events and we create kind of like experiences of any kind. For me, Lollipop has to be kind of like a buzz for ideas. So if I want to do an event around anchovies and lambic beer, I would
Mm-hmm.
love to like call the crazy people from Lollipop, and then they might give me like, okay, the structure to do so, and then we'll go to this place, and then these people will bring the wine. So it's kind of like building things for the sake of doing things. Because like
Mm-hmm.
as Ramon from Mugaritz would say, if you don't do things, things won't happen. And that is important. So in Lollipop, sometimes we do things, we try to do them with sense. Sometimes we don't use it at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fun, and we get to meet people, and we cook, and yeah,
Yeah,
it's a lot of joy.
sounds like you've gathered some good people, some great energy over there.
Yeah.
And I mean, the stuff that I've seen from it, yeah, so it looks super interesting. But the reason I wanted to know this is because, for me, all the interviews I have with chefs like you or people like you who are fugitive chefs, as I call them, I always am very curious to know how's things at life level, like everyday level. Like, for example, I spoke to Eddie last week, and Eddie was like, he misses, for example, the rush. A lot of them say they miss the rush of a kitchen, they miss the company or having people around you, and not being, say, PhD can be very lonely. In the end, you're alone dealing with this, you're going to be the face and the name behind this project that you present at the end of your PhD. But how is for you the experience? How's life on a mental level, physical, the amount of time you have? How's the comparison you would make to being a chef in a kitchen?
To be very honest with you, I don't really miss it because like one thing that you have in a kitchen is a lot of routine. So
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I like about like let's say my job right now is that I kind of like my day and there's a lot of uncertainty and I love uncertainty in some way. So for me, like having a day where I know that I'm gonna start at 8 a.m. and I'm gonna finish at 5 p.m. and I know exactly everything that's gonna happen, that kills me. A day that and I'm will confess I work a lot. I love working, so I might stay from like yeah 8 to like whatever, and I don't mind it because I kind of like cook it myself. So I don't really miss the kitchen. Obviously, there's the aspect of having a team and a purpose, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's really cool. Like this, let's say the non-food side of a kitchen, the commitment towards one same objective, the amount of conversations, like all of that, I miss it a lot. Yes, but I don't miss having to deal with food with my hands, if that makes sense.
No, completely. I think, yeah, it fits. It fits completely what you said.
'Cause I've never been really good at it, Furqan, to be fair. I mean, I think we didn't cross in Mugaritz as like, you at that time you were working there and I was like
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
stash. But like, thanks God you didn't because I was like, I don't know, like, I have no equilibrium, no sense of balance. I have no sense of like order in that sense. So I was really no good with my hands. So a big thank you for the kitchen.
No, definitely. I think, and I mean, I wouldn't agree with all of it what you said, but I think like, yeah, what you explained is something I think Joseph said this very clearly. Like Joseph said, people associate kitchen people or chefs to be very creative or to be people who are super creative. And I feel you are very creative. I feel all the work you've done or the time we spent together, I feel you're somebody who thinks out of the box, which explains why you see yourself as a misfit in a kitchen. Because as Joseph said, and I'll quote him, that kitchens are the most boring places because in the end of the day, only one person, and he actually was quoting Heston from Fat Duck. He said, Heston said kitchens are the least creative places because one person gets to be creative and the rest are just supposed to mimic and repeat that as much as possible. Now, Mugaritz is a very non-organic place where all plates look different, but the end, the creative driver is, if not one person, it's one vision of how things have to be. That's why, for me, it makes complete sense that you feel that that's not your space because you're supposed to deliver consistently the same kind of result.
Yeah, for sure. And there's this Spanish like he was a physicist, but then he ended up being a philosopher. He passed away a few years ago. His name is Jorge Wavensger, and I
Okay.
highly recommend him if you want to like read a little bit of creativity.
Uh
And he
huh.
would say that like calories fuel the muscles, and change fuels the brain. And if you want to keep on moving, you need to expose yourself to change, and you need to you know set yourself a little bit uncomfortable. And hey, that can happen in a kitchen as well. Like,
Yeah.
you can, instead of like putting the fish on this position every time, you can put it like every day on a different way. I don't know. And then
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
face yourself with a different challenge.
Definitely.
We, but it's easier to do it if you're outside because obviously inside a kitchen you have a lot of pressure and then it's very efficient, very, very efficient. So like there's not that much room as you said. And I completely agree with that. But yeah, I think that everyone is also responsible to like, even though if you're working on a Lego factory,
Mhm.
creating Lego blocks, you need to put yourself with your context in the most uncomfortable position as possible because that's going to fuel your brain a little bit,
Yeah.
I think. I
Yeah.
hope.
No, definitely. Totally in agreement, Curro. Before we run out of time, Curro, tell us a little about your PhD because, I mean, for those who do not know, Curro is in the first year of his PhD. It's still very early. But still, I would like to know what's your line of work because, super interestingly, the first guest on the podcast was Daniel Lassa, who is the man behind Ama Brewery, where you're currently working and building up your PhD. So tell us about what does that feel like? What are the early stages of research?
Okay, so I'm doing an industrial PhD, which that means that you need to spend around 50% of your time outside university, and you need to work in a company during that time. And I approach the people at Ama Brewery, which for whoever is listening and doesn't know what Ama Brewery is, they make non-alcoholic low alcoholic pet nuts throughout mixed consortia fermentation. So what it would be kind of like a kombucha, they brew it and then they age it, knowing what they're doing, and they come up with these incredible pet nuts with like incredible bubbles and really cool flavors. And now I'm is in a process of like changing a lot of methodologies of production and changing a lot of like tools to produce. They're like Danny is like absolutely crazy, Danny, and the whole team that is there, Laura and Aaron. They're really cool people, and they have like a very interesting view on fermentation, especially on non or low alcohol beverages. And that's where my PhD fits very well because what I wanted to do was to like study throughout, let's say, statistics in some way, what kind of outputs you could get from a fermentation of just one microbe. So, like, imagine I have one strain of yeast that I like. And what I'm going to do with that yeast is I'm going to put it in 7 bioreactors with just changing one condition. Maybe it could be pH, it could be amount of oxygen that it can get access to, it could be the sugar, the nitrogen, many things. And then throughout 2 years, you just gather a lot of data, data, and then you kind of try to build a Facebook of strains where you kind of like know what they're gonna do with certain amount of certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're trying to do inside AMA from the PhD side, is building what is called predictive models of fermentation. And we do so by using these really cool machines. Everything is, and it should be around open science. And there's this company in Canada, and then a little bit of advertisement as well. But like they are called bioreactors, and they came out with a design of a bioreactor with all of the functionalities that you could expect from a bioreactor,
Mm-hmm.
but from like 240 euros. So
Wow.
normally a bioreactor could cost like 20,000 K. So it's really cool. And we work with those very little machines. We have a ton of them all online. And then we just carry a lot of like little fermentations in order to pursue flavor and to try to understand how microbial interactions work. Because it's really fascinating. I'm sorry I'm speaking so much, but this is
No,
like,
please.
it's really cool. This story I'm going to tell you happened to me like a few weeks ago. And it made me think a lot about humanity. And it
Oh.
was, okay, so there's this non-Saccharomyces yeast strain, which is called
Mm-hmm.
Mesnicovia. And, the first approach to fermentation where you're studying it is like, we should focus on microbes because they cooperate together and they're like super good friends and they're like the best metaphor for humanity to be us. We should all be microbes, which I think
Mm-hmm.
that microbes are an insane metaphor to speak out cooperation and well-being, but sometimes they can be very evil.
Mm-hmm.
And this strain has like this unique feature, which when it's fermenting, to make sure that there's not other microbes thriving around, she produces, and I say she, it produces what is called spulcherenic acid, and this
Mm-hmm.
acid interacts with iron in the liquid, and
Oh.
then it turns pink. But the thing is, like any microorganism, most of them, at least the eukaryotes, they need iron to grow. So this yeast strain doesn't even need it, but it's canceling it out just to make sure that there's no other microbes thriving. And I was like, fermentation is not as friendly as we thought. I thought it was interesting. Super off topic, sorry, and really random, but like, yeah.
No, no, no. I think all these worlds which simultaneously are growing with us, which we are not aware about, are kind of also reflecting reality in all these small biospheres. But it's super interesting for me. It's like, yeah, very inspiring to hear this coming from you because also for people who are listening to the podcast, where at like for the first 20 minutes we're talking about like learning and hospitality and kitchen and front of house, and then explaining these very technical jobs that you're doing today, and that is the whole point of the podcast to show that journeys like the ones you've made, it's a matter of 4 years. For me, it's like super cool to remember that I saw you 4 years ago, 5 years ago in Mugaritz, starting to intern in a restaurant, and today where you are, it's a big leap, you know. And I feel the reason this podcast exists and the reason we need to hear stories like yours is to see the possibilities of how pivoting is never too early, never too late. It's never, it's an
100%,
endless
yeah.
world, right? I mean, you can keep pivoting. And I mean, who knows if 5 years later you are in still kombucha world, or you found something which is your next pivot. And I feel, yeah, I think that's for me the most inspirational part. And a lot of it comes from just networking, knowing the right people, going to your mentors, as you explained, and
Yeah.
asking them for advice and what you
100%.
can do next. But based on this, Curro, and to wrap this up, for somebody listening to you, like think of yourself 5 years ago, interning at a restaurant, not knowing if this is where, like the world has told you this is the, I mean, the epitome of creativity you can reach, and you still have something more in yourself, you know? So what would you say to somebody like that if they have an idea? Should they leap, and how should they make that kind of a leap?
So I would say, like, first of all, take it easy. Like, we are really good at thinking that things are very important, but sometimes they aren't. And I think that it's good to have fun and to laugh and to not take things too seriously. Because you can you can be excellent without not smiling, you know? And that's something very important. Like, people out there, calm down. Like, it's fine. Like, tomorrow, my plant hopefully will be green, you know, even though if I burn down all of my PhD projects, probably the plant will be green. So relax. I would say also, obviously, respect yourself and especially respect your family and friends, whoever you are, thanks to the people that surrounds you. And when, especially maybe in kitchens, and when you have an ambition, and maybe you can correlate to these as well, Furqan, you sometimes forget that, hey, you have friends and you have a family, maybe not, but like at least myself, I have a family that I love, and I need to invest. If I could give an advice to that person 5 years ago, I would be like, invest maybe more time in your family and friends, and also have fun. Don't take things too seriously, you know. And yeah, things happen for a reason, so take it easy.
No, totally in agreement. I think a lot of what you're saying is, again, as you said, I can relate with it. And I feel it's also because how this career is very passion driven, which is good. I think it lets you do things that a normal person can't. The passion is the key ingredient, which lets you push yourself that much. But again, it's very important to remember the cost of things, to remember how it's still a career, it's still a job. And there's always, you're not giving up on your dreams if you're just changing them and directioning them into towards a different tide altogether, right? So yeah, I think it's been a very fruitful conversation for me. I think for somebody who has known you, still have learned so much from this conversation, and I hope the same for people who are listening to this. I'm going to leave your links and your Instagram down here in the description so people can follow your work and see what's coming out of this, because I feel the PhD is going to definitely come with a lot of cool results, and also the things that you're doing with Lollipop. And yeah, once again, thank you for your time, Curro. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for building this platform, Furqan. This is really awesome what you're doing. So keep on pushing because it's really cool.
Happy to hear that.